Hey, welcome to the third and final short lecture from Chapter 9 in your textbook. And in this one, we're going to be talking a little bit about masculinity. So, notions of gender, as we've already discussed, again, have to do, and I want to stress this point. When we talk about gender, what we're talking about are notions, socially constructed notions. So, in other words, culturally derived notions of masculinity and femininity. You know, we're not talking about biological sex. We're talking about gender, about what's masculine and what's feminine. So when we study this, right, when we study gender and organizational communication critically, one of the things that we recognize is that groups who possess the most power tend to position themselves as the norm, right? So this shouldn't really be surprising, but maybe you've heard the phrase normative before. So that just means that it's positioned as normal. So if white middle-aged men are have the power in an organization, they're going to structure things either consciously or perhaps even unconsciously, so that that status, right, that white middle-aged male status, it looks like the norm. And in a way, because it's normalized, because it's naturalized, because it's made to seem natural, it becomes rather kind of invisible. Now, typically, if we were in class at this point, and maybe I'll do this when we meet up for our next meeting on the 2nd, typically I'd ask you, what do you think about this statement? Do you think this is true? Is this something that you've observed? Does it make sense? Is it something that you think represents our reality right now in this day and age? I'm always intrigued to hear my students' real life experiences and whether or not they think that academic theories reflect what they've experienced. And so maybe we'll talk about this in our next meeting. When we're talking about masculinity, it's important to recognize that even the term masculinity really only emerged in the last century, during the 1900s, and it replaced manliness, right, as a descriptor. Specifically, it replaced manliness as a descriptor, in describing appropriate male behavior and identity. So, prior to masculinity becoming a term, manliness was used to describe things, characteristics like honor, high-mindedness, strength from self-mastery, right? All these different things. That's what was considered to be manly, right? Now, womanhood in relation was complementary, because it involved being pious, the maternal guardianship of virtue, and the domestic sphere, right, the homemaking and so on, right, running the house, and things like that, and so again, if we were meeting in person, I'd want to talk a little bit about the notion of guardianship of virtue, because this is, of course, when they're talking about guardianship of virtue, what they're referring to is, not having a lot of sex, right? I mean, that's literally what that means if we want to get past the euphemism and talk about it for what it is. And this still continues today, right? Even in our society today, even though we don't call it the guardianship of virtue, slut shaming and things like that, quote unquote slut shaming, are still common, right? And women still catch hell at points for their own sexuality, right? And for the performance of their sexuality, and so I submit to you that this is sort of a weird and I think an antiquated notion, right? The guardianship of virtue, and of course it's really ultimately, I think, linked to the idea of prior to the 1960s, not really having things like the pill, right, and adequate forms of birth control. So women were placed in a situation where having sex came with a very real risk of having children. And so this is kind of a leftover idea, I think, in a way, from this time, and one that clearly women were saddled with for ages, right? But I'm not sure that it shouldn't die out. Based on where we're at now, it's interesting to see how these ideas that are arguably quite outmoded linger in society, right? And again, I'd be interested in discussing that with you. So masculinity, manliness changes. This idea of manliness changes during the 19th century. So this is during the 1800s. So what we see during this period of time, of course, is that there are socioeconomic changes that are taking place related to modernity. So we see the economic landscape shifts from small businesses to focus on large corporations. The percentage of middle-class men who are self-employed drops precipitously from about 67% down to 37%. You remember from a previous chapter that prior to the late 1800s, the notion of being an employee was really looked down upon, right? And was considered to be against the principles on which this nation was founded. So what we see then is changing socioeconomic attitudes and practices. And then on top of this, we see that middle-class male power is challenged on two distinct fronts. So on the first front, women are demanding the right to vote, universal suffrage, right? So the right to vote. And we also see working-class men and immigrants gaining political power through things like labor unions, right? Through organized labor. And so because their manliness, quote unquote, was being challenged during this time, middle-class men turned towards aggressive activities, feats of physical prowess, and sexually aggressive practices to reassert their gender identity. So the theory here goes, right, that as these traditional ideas of manliness are being challenged on all these different fronts, and as the world of work is changing, men switch, right, and they look towards other things like aggressive activities like sports, right, their own physical prowess, sexually aggressive practices, so being a womanizer, right, and all these become markers of masculinity and gender identity during this time, because the old markers are fading away, and men don't know what to do, so this is what they turn to. Now, Baderman, the academic, says that middle-class men during this time, during the late 19th century, along with adopting these new ideas, adopted a whole new vocabulary to make fun of behavior that seemed unmanly. So examples of this are words like pussyfoot, sissy, stuffed shirt. All these pejorative terms come out of this time, right? Because they're representative of this new kind of idea of masculinity, right? Which is more overtly macho in many ways than it used to be, right? And indeed, what we find is that these terms now are being used to describe behavior that was once just considered self-possessed to be generally good qualities, right? But now they're associated with the feminine, and men who do it are considered to be feminine in their nature, right? They're not manly enough. So Baderman says that this new form of masculinity was dominant by the 1930s. So by that he's saying this new way of looking at masculinity really had just caught on and become dominant by the 1930s. And it still prevails today. That it's still going on today. Now, your book tells you that terms to describe masculinity today might be words like aggressive, strong, heterosexual, assertive, independent, individual, right? But we still need to recognize in the face of these descriptors that this form of dominant masculinity isn't natural for men, right? It's not just men are naturally assertive, naturally independent, naturally individualistic, right? Instead, these are just products of this specific historical, economic, political, and social moment, right? These can change, and probably will, right? And in fact, I'd suggest to you that they're really kind of changing now, right? With all the talk of gender fluidity and notions of multiple genders and so on, our ideas of what's masculine and feminine are changing, right? So ideas... Again, this all links back to this idea that gender isn't biological sex. Gender is how people in a culture think of being masculine or being feminine or being anything in between or beyond, right? So these, of course, then are related to gender roles. And so gender roles are those roles that are acted out and produced in society through interaction with others. And these others then hold us accountable for playing out these roles. So your book gives you an example where a pilot gets on his jet and he's helping the stewardess, or flight attendant, I guess I should say now, right? Helping the flight attendant fold blankets. And she says to him, "You're a pilot. Pilots don't fold blankets," right? And so this shows you that the notions of labor and your position in an organization are gendered, right? I mean, we have gendered jobs, and we probably don't like to admit it, but we do, right? I mean, I've asked classes this oftentimes, but I'll just tell you an experience that I had that was weird, and I had to stop myself and think about it a little bit. But my kids were going to daycare, and they were real little, and the new daycare teacher was a man, right? And I was like, whoa, what's that about, right? Because every single other person that I ever encountered in a daycare from the time I was born through 40-some years old was that women worked in daycares, right? And that men didn't. And so that was really surprising to me, and it showed to me, right, that this is a gendered occupation. It's just a role that we naturally associate with a specific gender. So again, these gender roles are sort of socially constructed ways that we imagine people acting. How you're supposed to act if you're a man, how you're supposed to act if you're a woman. So we see these ideas a lot. So, for example, my kids at Little League, they were playing Little League, and this one little boy was playing first base and took a throw, took a ball right to the mouth, right, smashed his lips against his teeth, blood everywhere, right, and the kid's freaking out, and his father comes over and starts yelling at him, and is like, "Come on, son, man up. You got to get back out there. Your team's counting on you. Come on, be a man, be a man." And that's a perfect example of gender roles, right? And how they're reinforced through the judgment of other people. I mean, that kid, for better or worse, is sitting there and he's like, okay, well, men don't cry when they play sports, even if they get hit in the fucking mouth and are bleeding everywhere. And he got back out there and he played a hell of a game. I'll give it to the kid. But I thought, like, when I was watching it and listening to his dad, I thought to myself, oh boy, if there's ever been an example of gender roles, I wish I could videotape this and show it to my class. So, something to think about, right? And your book tells you this accountability, so the accountability for being male or female, leaves us open to sanction or criticism when we fail to meet the standards of the organization or those around us. So this is the kind of thing where if you're in a meeting and you're a guy and you're in a business meeting, a negotiation, and you start to cry, right? Everybody's going to be like, what the hell is the matter with you, right? And that's about gender roles. And we're accountable for playing out these roles for better or worse in many instances. And like I said, these can change, but I mean, they're there, right? There are social expectations for behavior, how you're supposed to act according to gender. So a good example of this comes up with Joseph Finder, who in 1987 wrote a famous piece for the New York Times that told of his experience as a secretary at a large bank. So Finder went to work as a secretary in a really large bank, and what he experienced while he was on the job was that people couldn't really believe he was a secretary, because that, of course, is a gendered position. And it's one that was traditionally occupied by women. And so what he ran into was people were asking him all the time if he was a temp or just filling in for somebody. His boss wouldn't give him the same kind of assignments, like making copies, that he would give to the women in the secretarial pool. Female workers didn't like him. They thought he was an interloper, that he was invading their space, right? That was a woman's job and that he shouldn't be doing it, so they didn't like him. And they just refused to accept the idea that this was his real job. They thought he was up to something, right? And so this shows you how deep sort of our prejudices go with regard to gender and the kind of roles that we view people as performing. And I submit to you that this kind of gendered thinking runs throughout culture. You know, it's not just about jobs and roles in organizations. I mean, I can remember growing up. You know, my friends and I, we're all car people. You know, we like cars because what teenage kid doesn't, right? We're really into cars, and I can remember having a conversation with my friend at the time about, man, you know, I was a valet for a while. I parked cars for my summer job at a country club, and I got to drive Mazda Miatas, you know, the little two-seater convertible. And I remember talking with my friend and saying, man, Miatas are fun as hell to drive. Man, this is a really awesome car. It's too bad it's a girl's car, you know, and we can't drive it. So that gives you another example, right, of gender roles and how it even extends to things as innocuous as driving, right, and what kind of car you drive and so on. So, you know, if you look for them, you can see these kinds of general roles out there. So normally I end this lecture with a series of questions that I pose to everyone in the class, not just the ladies, but, you know, are you a feminist and why or why not? Where did your idea of feminism come from, right? What is your idea of feminism? Can you think of a time when you didn't perform gender properly in society? And how do you think your gender, your idea of who you are, influences your identity, right? How you think of, you know, if you're a guy, how does being masculine, quote unquote, influence your identity? And I think these are all really interesting questions that we can ask ourselves if we pause and reflect a little bit. And maybe, again, we'll be able to talk about these when we meet the next time. All right, well, thanks again for checking out my my video, and that's it for Chapter 9. Thanks again.